I thought filing an HR complaint would quietly disappear into another corporate folder. Instead, 21 days later, executives stopped avoiding my eyes. The legal department called me by name, and the company offered me $325,000 because one email they hoped no one would ever read changed everything. For nearly 10 years, I had been the kind of employee most companies claimed they wanted but rarely noticed. I showed up early, left when the work was done, and never looked for applause. My desk sat beside the same window overlooking the parking lot, where the morning sun painted long golden stripes across the asphalt. Every season had its own rhythm. Coffee brewing before 8, quiet greetings exchanged in the hallway, the soft hum of keyboards before meetings began. It wasn't exciting, but it was honest work, and I was proud of the reputation I'd built, one ordinary day at a time. In almost a decade, I had never filed an HR complaint, not once. Whenever coworkers argued, I stayed professional. Whenever deadlines became impossible, I found solutions instead of excuses. My annual performance reviews described me with words like reliable, consistent, and trusted. They weren't glamorous compliments, but they meant something to me. Then our new manager arrived. At first, everyone welcomed him. He spoke confidently during his introduction, smiling with the polished charm that seemed designed for executive meetings. He promised higher performance, stronger accountability, and a culture of excellence. Leadership applauded his vision, and many of us believed fresh leadership might even improve the department. For about 2 weeks, it looked like they were right. Then the atmosphere began to change in ways that were almost impossible to explain. The first incident seemed too small to matter. A new analyst stumbled while presenting quarterly numbers. Instead of correcting the mistake privately, our manager leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and laughed loud enough for the entire conference room to hear. "Did we hire you?" he asked with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Or did someone lose a bet?" The room froze. Nobody laughed. Nobody defended her. When the meeting ended, the young analyst locked herself in a restroom stall for nearly 30 minutes. The following morning, everyone acted as though nothing had happened. That was when I realized silence could become part of a company's routine. Weeks passed, and the behavior escalated. Meetings stopped feeling like discussions and started feeling like public trials. People weren't asked questions, they were interrogated. Mistakes weren't corrected, they were displayed. Compliments disappeared completely. Even successful projects ended with criticism about something that should have been better. The office itself seemed different. Conversations became whispers. Laughter vanished from the break room. Employees checked whether the manager was nearby before speaking openly. Even the familiar click of keyboards sounded more cautious, as if everyone feared typing too loudly. Our team's chats changed too. Instead of casual jokes and quick collaboration, messages became painfully formal. Every sentence was carefully written, every response reviewed twice before hitting enter. People weren't communicating anymore. They were protecting themselves. Then came the unpaid overtime. "Real commitment doesn't stop at 5, the manager announced during one Monday meeting. No policy changed, no overtime approval appeared, no additional compensation was discussed. Yet somehow, everyone understood the expectation. People stayed until 7, then 8, sometimes 9. The office lights reflected against the dark windows long after sunset, turning the floor into a strange island of glowing computer screens surrounded by empty streets. Outside, the city went home. Inside, we kept working because nobody wanted to become tomorrow's example. I noticed something else. Every employee who questioned the workload suddenly received harsher criticism. Every disagreement found its way into a performance conversation. Every request for balance became a conversation about professional attitude. Patterns are invisible until you've seen enough of them. Once you do, they're impossible to ignore. The moment that changed everything arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. One of my coworkers, Daniel, had spent almost a year leading one of our largest client projects. Everyone knew how much effort he had invested. He solved impossible deadlines, trained new employees, and even covered responsibilities outside his role when another department fell behind. His annual bonus wasn't just expected, it was deserved. That afternoon, he walked into the manager's office carrying a notebook. 20 minutes later, he walked out without it. His face had lost all color. He packed his laptop in complete silence. When I quietly asked whether he was okay, he forced a smile that collapsed almost immediately. "My performance review says I failed multiple objectives," he whispered. I stared at him. That couldn't be true. I had personally attended project meetings proving those objectives had been completed months earlier. Daniel shook his head slowly. They changed the documentation. For a moment, the entire office seemed to stop breathing. No one said anything. But several people exchanged the same uneasy glance, the kind that silently asks one terrifying question. If they could do this to him, who would be next? That evening, I stayed behind after everyone left. Not because I wanted to, because something didn't feel right. I opened old project folders. I compared completed reports with archived emails. Then I checked our team's conversations. Tiny inconsistencies began appearing, like cracks spreading across glass. Dates no longer matched. Comments had been rewritten in official summaries. Completed milestones were suddenly described as unfinished concerns. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, it painted a picture I couldn't ignore. For the first time in nearly 10 years, I forwarded several work emails into a carefully organized folder. Then I exported important Teams conversations. I also saved copies of project documents that still showed the original timelines before anyone could quietly replace them. I didn't know whether I would ever need them. I only knew I would regret losing them. Driving home that night, rain blurred the windshield into streaks of silver light. Every traffic signal looked softer than usual, as though the city itself were hiding behind a curtain. My phone buzzed twice with routine work notifications, but I left them unanswered. Something inside me had shifted. For years, I believed that doing excellent work was enough to stay safe. Now I wasn't so sure. And somewhere inside the company's servers, hidden between ordinary emails and forgotten Teams messages, were pieces of a story that someone desperately hoped would never be put together. By the next morning, I had made a decision that would change every part of my life. You won't believe what happened after that decision. The next morning, I filed the HR complaint. No dramatic speech, no confrontation. I sat at my kitchen table before sunrise, reviewed every sentence twice, and attached the evidence. Emails, Teams messages, project records, and copies of Daniel's original performance documents. I described the public humiliation, the unpaid overtime, the threats, and the way employees who pushed back suddenly became performance problems. Then I clicked submit. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then an automated message appeared. Your complaint has been received and will be reviewed confidentially. Confidentially. That word almost made me laugh. By noon, my manager knew. He stepped out of his office and looked directly at me across the floor. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse me. He simply held my gaze for several seconds, then smiled. It was the kind of smile you see just before a door locks. At 1:15, a project coordinator removed me from our largest client account. At 2:40, 3 recurring meetings vanished from my calendar. At 4:05, I received a Teams message from my manager. Going forward, leadership discussions will be limited to employees who demonstrate full alignment. I took a screenshot. The retaliation had started less than 8 hours after my HR complaint. The next few days moved fast. Responsibilities I had managed for years were reassigned without explanation. Coworkers stopped copying me on emails. Decisions were made in meetings I hadn't been invited to attend. And then I was criticized for not knowing about them. It was clever. Not one action looked serious enough on its own. Together, they formed a cage. On Friday morning, my manager called me into his office. He left the door open. That was deliberate. "You seem unhappy," he said. "I'm focused on my work." He tapped a pen against his desk. Some people confuse longevity with importance. I said nothing. His expression hardened. "You've been here a long time. I'd hate to see that end badly." The office outside went silent. Everyone could hear him, but no one looked up. He wanted witnesses to the threat. He also wanted them afraid. I walked back to my desk, wrote down his exact words, and emailed the notes to myself with the time and date. That afternoon, HR finally contacted me. The HR business partner spoke in a smooth, careful voice. She thanked me for raising concerns and said an internal investigation had begun. She asked whether I had supporting evidence. I attached it to the complaint. There was a pause. Another person joined the call. He introduced himself as a representative from the legal department. The temperature of the conversation changed instantly. They asked me to explain the timeline again. They wanted dates, names, exact phrases, and details about who had been present. I answered everything. Before the call ended, the lawyer asked one final question. "Has your manager treated you differently since the complaint was filed?" I looked at the empty spaces on my calendar. Yes. I sent them the screenshot from Teams, the project removal notice, and a list of every meeting from which I had been excluded. 2 hours later, my manager scheduled my annual performance review for Monday morning. It was 3 months early. That weekend, I barely slept. I kept replaying every possible outcome. Maybe HR would stop him. Maybe the evidence would matter. Maybe 10 years of strong reviews would protect me. Monday destroyed that illusion. My new performance review described me as resistant, disruptive, and insufficiently loyal to leadership. It claimed I had communication problems and struggled to adapt to corporate culture. I read the document twice. None of those accusations had appeared in any previous review. My manager leaned back in his chair. "Do you disagree?" "Yes." "Of course you do." I placed copies of my last 5 reviews on the table. Every one of them rated my performance as strong or exceptional. He barely glanced at them. People change. So do performance records, apparently. His jaw tightened. For the first time, the mask slipped. He ended the meeting and told me to return to my desk. By lunch, my system access had been restricted. I could still open email, but several project folders were gone. My administrative permissions had disappeared. Teams channels I had used for years now displayed a gray message saying I no longer had access. Someone was erasing my place in the company while I was still sitting inside it. I immediately sent HR another email. This appears to be workplace retaliation following my complaint. Please preserve all relevant records, including emails, Teams chats, access logs, performance documents, and communications between management and HR. That sentence changed everything. A request to preserve records meant the company could no longer safely delete, edit, or lose evidence without creating an even larger problem. My manager seemed to understand that. The next morning, he avoided me completely. For one brief moment, I thought the legal department had intervened. Then, just after 10 o'clock, I received a meeting invitation titled Employment Status Discussion. The meeting lasted 9 minutes. My manager sat beside the HR business partner. A termination letter rested on the table between them. The official reason was failure to align with corporate culture. No warning, no improvement plan, no chance to respond. 2 weeks after filing my complaint, I was fired. I placed my badge on the table and walked through the office, carrying a cardboard box with a coffee mug, 2 notebooks, and a small plant I had kept alive for 7 years. No one spoke. But as the elevator doors began to close, Daniel stepped forward. "I saw what they did," he said. Then another coworker stood up. So did I. By the end of that day, HR received 4 witness statements. By the end of the week, they had more than 10. Employees described the same intimidation, the same altered performance reviews, and the same retaliation against anyone who challenged the manager. Then the legal department found an internal email sent shortly after my complaint. In it, my manager asked the HR business partner how quickly they could remove the source of the problem. The company had fired me while investigating the man I had reported. And now, the evidence was pointing straight at the people who believed they could bury it. They still had no idea how expensive that mistake was about to become. If you've ever watched someone abuse their power at work, let me know in the comments. And if you want more true-to-life workplace stories where justice wins the right way, don't forget to subscribe. The morning after I was fired, I expected silence. Instead, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The first call came from Daniel. "I've already spoken to HR," he said. "I told them exactly what happened with my performance review." He wasn't the only one. By lunchtime, 3 former coworkers had reached out. None of them wanted their jobs back anymore. They simply didn't want the truth buried with my termination. Within days, HR received more than 10 witness statements. Different people, different departments, the same story. Public humiliation during meetings, employees pressured into unpaid overtime, performance reviews that suddenly turned negative after someone disagreed with the manager, and, in my case, retaliation that began almost immediately after filing an official HR complaint. The company's internal investigation quickly grew far beyond my original report. This was no longer about one employee. It was about a pattern. A week later, my attorney called. "They've started producing internal documents." "What kind?" "The kind they hoped we'd never see." Among thousands of emails was one exchange that changed everything. Just 2 days after my complaint had reached HR, my manager emailed the HR business partner. His message was short. We need to remove the source of the problem before this spreads. The reply wasn't much better. Let's discuss options. My attorney let the silence linger. That's no longer a management issue, he said. That's evidence. The legal department immediately took control of the investigation. Executives who had ignored warning signs suddenly wanted daily updates. What began as an HR complaint had evolved into a serious legal risk involving workplace retaliation and possible wrongful termination. The company also launched an independent review of recent performance evaluations. It didn't take long to find more inconsistencies. Several employees had received sharply lower ratings without supporting documentation. In 2 cases, managers had changed evaluation comments after they were initially approved. Daniel's review was one of them. Every discovery strengthened the same conclusion. The retaliation wasn't accidental. It was organized. By the second week, my attorney received a call from the company's outside counsel. They wanted to meet before any lawsuit was officially filed. That alone told us everything. Companies don't rush into settlement discussions when they believe they'll win. They do it when the evidence keeps getting worse. The meeting lasted less than an hour. No one admitted wrongdoing. No one apologized. Instead, they asked careful questions about my damages, my future employment, and whether I would consider resolving the matter without going to court. As we left the building, my attorney smiled for the first time since taking my case. They're negotiating, he said quietly. They've realized this isn't just about your termination anymore. It was about every decision that followed my complaint, and how expensive those decisions were about to become. 3 weeks after my termination, my attorney called before 9 in the morning. They're ready to make an offer. I had expected months of depositions, discovery requests, and a long court battle. Instead, the company wanted to settle before a lawsuit became public. We met that afternoon. On one side of the conference table sat my attorney. Across from us were 2 corporate lawyers, a senior executive and a representative from the legal department. My former manager wasn't there, neither was the HR business partner. The executive spoke first. We believe it's in everyone's best interest to resolve this matter. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just carefully chosen legal language. My attorney opened a thick binder. I disagree, he said calmly. It's in your company's best interest because your own documents support my client's claims. He placed several exhibits on the table. The first contained witness statements from 12 current and former employees. The second included screenshots from Teams conversations, showing how I was removed from meetings immediately after filing my HR complaint. The third contained my previous performance reviews, nearly 10 years of consistently positive evaluations, followed by the sudden review accusing me of being insufficiently loyal only days after my complaint. Then he produced the internal email. We need to remove the source of the problem before this spreads. No one questioned its authenticity. The room became noticeably quieter. One attorney asked for a short break. When everyone returned 20 minutes later, the conversation had changed. No one argued that my termination was justified anymore. Instead, they focused on risk. What are your client's expectations? My attorney answered without hesitation. Fair compensation, attorney's fees, and enough accountability to reflect the seriousness of what happened. Negotiations continued for hours. The company's first offer wasn't even close. My attorney rejected it within seconds. The evidence has only become stronger since we walked into this room, he said. Every additional witness increases your exposure. Another break followed. The executive stepped outside twice to speak with the board. Each time he returned, the offer increased. Eventually, late in the afternoon, he placed a revised agreement on the table. The company is prepared to resolve this matter for $325,000. This time, no one spoke for several seconds. My attorney carefully reviewed every page, making sure the agreement covered compensation, attorney's fees, and every financial obligation discussed during negotiations. He also confirmed that the settlement required no admission of misconduct from me and preserved my professional reputation. Only then did he slide the agreement toward me. The money arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. There were no celebrations, no dramatic speeches, just a notification from my bank confirming that the settlement had been deposited. $325,000. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen. 3 weeks earlier, I had walked out of the building carrying a cardboard box, convinced that 10 years of loyalty had ended with a security badge that no longer opened the front door. Now, the same company had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to resolve what one manager had started with a single act of retaliation. A few days later, my attorney called one last time. It's officially over. No appeal, no additional hearings, no surprises. The case was closed. News traveled faster than I expected. Former coworkers began reaching out. Some wanted to thank me. Others admitted they had almost reported the same behavior years earlier, but were too afraid to become the next target. One message stayed with me. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You gave the rest of us permission to stop pretending everything was normal. Not everyone stayed at the company. Within a few months, several talented employees accepted positions elsewhere. Some said the investigation had changed the workplace for the better. Others believed the damage had already been done. Both could be true. I chose not to go back. Instead, I accepted an offer from another company. During the interview, no one asked whether I was loyal enough. They asked about the projects I had led, the teams I had supported, and the problems I knew how to solve. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone was evaluating my experience instead of my willingness to stay silent. A month into my new job, I caught myself smiling during a team meeting. Someone made a mistake. The manager calmly explained how to fix it. Nobody was embarrassed. Nobody was mocked. The meeting simply moved on. I almost forgot what that felt like. Looking back, I realized the settlement was never the real victory. The real victory was proving that intimidation isn't leadership, that retaliation isn't corporate culture, and that carefully saved emails, Teams messages, witness statements, and the courage to speak up can outweigh titles, power, and fear. One complaint started an internal investigation. One investigation exposed years of misconduct. One decision to tell the truth forced executives to confront what they had ignored. Justice didn't arrive because the company suddenly found its conscience. It arrived because the facts left them with no other choice. If I had stayed silent, my manager would have found another target. Instead, he lost his position. The complaint process was rewritten. An independent corporate culture audit became mandatory. And every employee who walked through those doors afterward entered a workplace that was safer than the one I had left. Sometimes people think courage looks loud. In my experience, it looked like pressing submit on an HR complaint after 10 years of keeping my head down. That single click cost me my job. it also gave me back my self-respect. And in the end, that was worth far more than $325,000. The decision is yours. I thought about everything that had happened over the previous 3 weeks, the retaliation, the humiliation. Walking out of the office carrying a cardboard box after giving that company almost 10 years of my life. No settlement could erase those memories. But accepting it wasn't about forgetting. It was about closing one chapter with the truth finally acknowledged, even if only behind closed doors. I signed. The payment was processed within days. Soon afterward, I learned my former manager had been terminated. The HR business partner also left the company during the restructuring that followed the investigation. The board ordered an independent corporate culture audit. HR overhauled its complaint procedures, and retaliation cases would now be reviewed directly with the legal department. Justice didn't arrive with applause. It arrived because facts, documents, and ordinary employees refused to stay silent.